Welcome, everyone. Perfection Learning is excited to have each of you joining us for tonight's webinar, Prepping Your Students for the AP English Exams. It's my pleasure to introduce our expert and our teacher for this evening, Dr. Brandon Abdon. Brandon comes to us with over 20 years of experience in the classroom, including 12 years as a high school English teacher, many years as a professor of English and education, and time as a curriculum developer and instructional coach. In addition to the time that Brandon spent in the classroom, he has more than 10 years of experience as a consultant and formerly worked as the lead director for the International Advanced Placement Program at the College Board. Brandon is a collaborator on a number of projects to support English teachers and their classrooms. This includes the Mosaic Slow Conference Project and the Garden of English. But as we always say, our favorite credential on Brandon's resume is as senior author of Perfection Learning's AP Literature and AP Language course books by AMSCO. Brandon, thank you so much for being here to share your knowledge, and I'm going to pass the presentation off to you.
Thank you so much, Kristen, and to everyone else at Perfection Learning for making this possible. If you hear some music in the background, it is because I have chosen to do my work today in the beautiful confines of Crossroads Church here in Oakley in Cincinnati, where they open up their entire atrium for work and coffee and so on. It's a wonderful opportunity to get to do things like this. So, all right, everyone. So I wanted to take some time tonight to review just a couple of things that often come up from teachers who are teaching the course, regardless of how much experience they have or don't have. These are things that are often, I want to say, frequently asked questions, but it's not just questions. It's things about process, it's things about encouraging kids and supporting kids. But I also want to take the opportunity, as we said in the announcement, to get some things from you at the end here. So we will have an opportunity at the end for some questions and responses from you, and the opportunity for you to share some of your great ideas. So a couple of things you see here on our agenda that we are going to cover. We'll look at a couple of points of emphasis. We'll talk about reviewing and really what that means. That'll mean more when we get to it. And of course, celebrating and building up students, my favorite part of this. That's the part I've really probably spent more time planning than I should have. And then we'll have our FAQs and Qs from you as we wrap up there at the end. So a couple of these points of emphasis for the AP Lit exam. I want us to think about the multiple choice questions. Now, before I get into this, I want to say that I know that so many of you have experience working with this course, working with this exam, and you're going to have different approaches that work for you and your students in your classroom. That's fantastic. I am in no way here to contradict the great work you're doing with your students. If anything, I'm here to build up some of that work. But if you hear something that goes against something you've been doing and you want to talk more about it, I'm sharing my contact information at the end, and I encourage you to reach out. Because when I say in my posts, when I'm sharing this on social media, come let's learn together, I mean it, because I always learn a ton from you all in the community. So let's talk about multiple choice. 50% is pretty good. Everybody needs to think about that and what that means. 50% on the multiple choice is good. 60% is great. And 70% is better than most of us could do in an hour. And this isn't just experience in the classroom. This is borne out from timing trials that we did when I was at College Board. It's also borne out by experiences in AP Summer Institutes where my students and I take these practice exams and then review some of our responses. Okay, so realize this, and a lot of you already do, is the way as you approach the training of your students. And I mean training, not just very particularly, not just teaching a multiple choice, but the training of how to do it. But it's really worth reminding students as you push towards the exam, because so many students are used to getting 85, 90, 95%, especially if they're high achieving students in their classroom exams. But this is not a classroom exam. It is not designed for people to ace it. As a matter of fact, in my time at College Board, I remember there was one student out of 600 and some odd thousand who took the language exam one year. One student got all of the multiple choice questions correct. Okay. Reminding your students of this is really important. And you may have a student who says, I'm going to be the next student to get them all right. Great. That's fantastic. Right. But really looking at a kid who's gotten 40% correct all year, and now you've just done a practice and suddenly they've gotten 50%, and you're like, look at this and celebrate that level of growth. Just to be clear, those percentages, since I'm talking to English teachers, the hard numbers are a 28, a 33, and a 39, respectively, out of 55 there. Okay, so it seems to us low as well. A couple of things I'd like you to think about as we approach exam time. Don't drill and drill the multiple choice questions. It's not useful for you, and it's not useful for students to go in day after day, or even go in week after week and do a full set of multiple choice that are timed. It's really not going to be helpful. It may help some students learn to manage time. It may help you learn to support certain students who are struggling with that time, but it's not going to be as helpful as you may think it would be. Do work on small sets of them. So if you want to take a full multiple choice test and just pull one passage or one poem and work on those questions, or work on a few of those questions that you know your students have struggled with all year, do that. And notice I say with corrections and discussion, because only in students correcting those questions that they get wrong do they realize the error of their thinking. And usually that thinking is related to the way they read the passage. That takes us to the next one. Don't focus on the content as the reasons that the questions are missed. It may not be, and likely isn't, a student's understanding of the passage. It may be the way the student applies a skill. So that's what I say here. Do work on test taking strategies and how they're applying the things that they know how to do to certain questions. And we'll talk about some of those here in just a moment. Now, this one may seem weird to you at first, but stay with me. Don't let them read passages blind. So you're saying, well, Brandon, I can't go in, I can't give them background. I can't support them. I can't tell them who Ted Kooser is and why he wrote this poem and what was happening when he wrote. No, that's not what I'm asking. Do show them how to read the questions and use those questions as a guide. Now, some people push back on this and say the students don't have time for it. It's one of the best strategies that I found in working with my students. And when I talk with teachers and show teachers how to do it, they usually admit, oh, I really see how the questions help to guide me. Here's the reason why. When we read a passage blind, we have to work on comprehending what's happening. Who are the characters? What's the situation? We don't have a prompt or anything to help us understand that, like we do on the essays, or like you would in a classroom. The questions will help students to focus in on things or be aware of things that are going to happen. They know that there's going to be a conflict between these two characters. Okay. They know that there's a character that's mentioned in 3 or 4 of the questions, so they know to really focus on that character. So using those question stems to help guide them and the way that they read the passage is very helpful. Now, I know that that's not the way we want them to mainly be able to read something in the real world. I get it. That's a test-taking strategy, but it will help them with the comprehension that will allow them to then move on to the thinking about the questions. Don't focus on questions they mostly get or even on the questions themselves. Do look closely at the skills for the questions they miss the most often. So just looking at the question can be really frustrating. But if you look at the skill and you realize that question 12 and question 4 are the same skill, that's telling you something. Thankfully, the course and exam descriptions that AP put out, as well as the most recent practice tests that they put out, have the full alignments to the AP skills. And so you can look at those pretty readily. Also, if you've been using AP Classroom, you can access that material on AP Classroom and see what those questions, what skills those questions have been aligned to. And so you can not only work with that with those questions, but outside of those questions as you look at passages that aren't necessarily multiple choice. Here's the last thing I want to remind you or tell you about the multiple choice before we move on. A lot of people don't know this, but those multiple choice questions are several years old. And they've gone through a very long process of development that has included being taken and reviewed by every member of the AP Literature Committee, professors and high school teachers. They take them blind, and then they revise them. And then they go to universities where they are field tested. And then they come back and they look, oh, well, lots of students missed this one, so maybe that one's too tricky. Let's not use that one. Everybody got this one right. Maybe that's really not getting what we need to get at. So there's lots of development that goes into there. It's not just someone sitting in a cubicle or an office somewhere or their home now writing questions. It is a long process and a very valuable process. To continue with a couple of things and some hints for the multiple choice, read question stems first before the reading itself, like I just mentioned. Focus on those skills related to reading the text, the AP course and exam description skill. Ask students to answer in a timed setting, and then have them return to the text for the information. Use it to justify their answers in writing, like an essay, and revise it. Have them write small paragraphs justifying their answers using the text. It will make them better thinkers about the questions themselves, because really the answer to every one of those multiple choice questions can be justified through a literary argument. I do not think you should ask students to write full essays on a multiple choice question. I think that is a waste of time. I bring that up because I've had people ask me that. Do spend time here with test taking strategies. Time management, huge. You might even, depending on the mindset of your students, how comfortable they are, how well you know them and your relationship with them, give them a passage that should take them 15 or 20 minutes and set a timer. And every minute and a half, have it go off and say, okay, you should have finished a question. Every minute and a half, you should have finished a question. You should have finished a question. Or give it to them and say, okay, you've got 4 minutes to read the question stems and the passage, and let them know. And they'll get nervous and they'll freak out, but you're going to forgive them. You're going to allow them to have corrections. You're going to let them talk through the process and get more comfortable with it. Some of you have been doing this since August, right? Some people haven't. I'm not saying you have to do it all year long. I don't know that it's good to do it all year long. But students do need to be prepared for the timedness of the exam. Okay. Moving past questions. If they don't know a question, if they get stuck on it, they got to move past it. Okay. But make sure and remind them that they leave a space for it on the answer sheet. Oh man, I've seen them get to the end and they've skipped one, and all of a sudden they're at question 54 and they have no idea and they got to go back and erase. So that's tough. You might have them mark it, put a little tick mark on the sheet. As long as they erase completely, there's no problem with that. And I will tell you that ETS, if they run a question sheet and there's an errant mark on it and the computer won't read it, then they sit down by hand and read it. They want the student to get the credit for the work they've done. Okay, so that little tick mark out beside of it isn't going to ruin their exam if it reminds them to come back and fill that one in. And that reminds me here, don't leave any blanks. Okay, students are not penalized for guessing. They are penalized for blanks. Don't leave any blanks. If they start to run out of time, guess. Finally, make it as fun as possible over the next several weeks. Gamify it. You can Google things. You can go on the Facebook groups and ask what are some of the games or activities you do. You can look in the files pages of the Facebook groups if you're a member of the AP Literature Facebook groups, which if you're not a Facebook person, I encourage you maybe to look at Facebook just for it, because it is a rich community of very supportive and knowledgeable people. And they're willing to share things, and they're willing to give honest answers and helpful answers. The second bullet here is something I love to do with multiple choice questions, not just for the AP exam, but move it around the room. Okay. Have you moved to a poster? Go to that corner for A, that corner for B. And you have to be ready to justify your answer. And people can move around as we eliminate answers. It really makes them dig into the text and really helps them evolve their thinking about the passage and their answers. And then think about a little bit more involved here, the third one, groups where a person is assigned a different answer and they have to argue it regardless of how wrong they know it is. So you got 5 people in a group and one person's A, another person's B, C, D, E, and every one of them has to be able to develop an argument for their answer. And then you help build consensus around that. It's not just a one-off, it's not just a 20-minute thing. Okay, it really helps them build some process, and you can work some writing into it. These things work. They're kind of fun. They build some camaraderie and collaboration with your students as well. Now let's think about the free response questions. The average is usually a 3.6 out of 6 on the 6-point rubric. Okay, and that's not just the past 2 years administrations. That is the, and sorry, it's going to get a little loud here. That is also looking at tests and practice exams that have been run. 4 out of 6 will get it done. Most students who get a 3 on the exam are going to get 4s and maybe a 3 on their essays. But you really want students to get over the hump and get a 4 on their essays. And when I say the hump exists really between 2 and 3 in the row B of the rubric. There's a big gap there. Most 5s on the exam, listen to this. This is huge. People don't believe me. I tell them, I say, go look at the data. I promise you. Most 5s on the exam, the top score on the exam, most of them will get a 5 out of 6 on the essays, not a 6. Very, very, very few students will get a 6 on the exam, on their essays. I'm talking like in the less than 1%. Why is the 6 there? It is there to reward students for doing really, really, really well. But students writing an essay in 40 minutes are not, overwhelmingly not going to get that 6. So just like we did with multiple choice, some things I'd like you to think about as you approach exam time. Don't drill and drill and drill essays. The more some of you have heard me say this before, the more you have them write, the more you give yourself to read. And you probably don't have to have them write as much in order to give the feedback and the direct instruction that you need to give. That's why I say, do work on thesis statements and paragraphs. Really. Yes, I know it's April. They should be writing full essays, and you might have them write a full essay, or a full essay on question 1, a full essay on question 2, a full essay on question 3 later on. You might have them do that, but then you're going to go back and you're going to look at those thesis statements. You're going to look at those paragraphs and let them use that to improve. I promise you, that's going to be much more effective, and you're going to feel better about what you're doing than just asking them to write essays all the time. Don't focus as much on their ability to understand the reading. Do work on their developing an interpretation and writing about it. So we're not going to focus as much on the comprehension of the reading. We want them to be able to jump into interpretation and writing about it. And that interpretation needs to be linked to the prompt. Now, some of you are going to email me and tell me I'm crazy for this because you do this and it's great with your students. I want to hear it. I want to hear you doing this and you being really successful with your kids. Great. But my advice is to not use the AP released items or to show your students a 6 or focus on a 6 at all. Do use your own students' examples, and focus on supporting students moving from a 3 to a 4 and a 4 to a 5. So why your own students' examples? Well, you have figured out a way to approach your students and a way to teach writing to your students and teach analysis and literary argument to your students. The moment you start showing them essays from other teachers, they are going to, and I know I'm generalizing here, they're going to see that they don't have to do what you're asking them to do. And the ones who really need to do it, who may have been fighting you all year, or the ones who've been struggling, may start trying something different. And you don't need to learn how to reteach them the month before the exam. So I really encourage you to hold on to those samples and look at the student who's moving from the 3 to a 4. Show that essay that was a 3 and then show the revision that is now a 4 and celebrate that. And ask students to say, what is the difference? How have they grown? We'll talk more about that in just a moment. And again, I'll get emails about this one and that's fine. I want to hear more about it. Okay, I've got a whole section in the textbooks about these things, but then I'm going to say, hey, don't worry about them. Don't worry so much about introductions and conclusions. You may say, oh, well, I've got this introduction template that helps kids get down to a thesis. Awesome. Okay, that's just part of your process. Okay, I really like conclusions over introductions because I like kids to wrap up what they've said in the essay by talking about the universal idea in the conclusion. And if they write an introduction, I may have them start to touch on the universal idea and then narrow down to talking about the passage. Okay, but I'm not going to harp on that because I've read many, many essays that have great introductions and then nothing happens in the body. And it's that body of the essay that matters most. So that's what I say. Do make certain their essays show analysis and understanding of argument. A couple things on essay questions here. If you've come to some previous or some of the most recent webinars, past couple months, you know, we've talked a lot about complexity. Complexity is inherent in each prompt. So one of the first things students should be able to do is find shifts, complexities, conflicts, paradoxes, or ambiguities. They should be able to find it. Shift happens. I hear a lot of people say that. I do a lot with the yin yang. Okay, what is a conflict? What is something in tension here? Because it's going to be there. Next is, what is it really about? Universal ideas. The beautiful thing about literature is, yes, it's telling a story or it's capturing something in poetry, but there's usually I'm going to say usually, there is a bigger idea. Some of us call this theme, but just the universal idea itself is not a theme. It needs to say something about it. And often it's going to relate to that complexity. I would say always going to relate to that complexity. Now, I'm not intending to call any individuals out here, but I will tell you in general, many AP Lit teachers neglect the and composition portion of the course. Teach more writing. Focus on writing. Focus on paragraphing. Focus on sentence writing. Okay, and you may say, oh, well, we do lots of essays. Doing essays, assigning essays is not teaching writing. Okay, so think about that. And one of the things I love to do, and you've heard me say it, you saw Carla in the chat just say this about using peer essays. One of my favorite things to do is take that essay that they've written and go back into it and work on revising it, because it sets the mindset of always getting better. Right, just like the philosopher said, everything is becoming, nothing is. I've already mentioned about breaking up time of class and asking them to do things in timed chunks with multiple choice. Here you see I've got some suggestions for the essays as well. Maybe giving them 10 minutes to read the prompt, the passage, and write a drafted thesis. giving them 10 to 15 minutes then to write a paragraph for that thesis. Really helping them see how they have to manage their time. And then finally, again, make it as fun as possible. Gamify it. I love the idea of having universal idea or interpretation debate teams where you've got 2 or 3 teams or 3 or 4, depending on how big your class is. And you ask them as a team to develop, what's the universal idea here? How do you know? What facts are you going to use from the text? What information from the text are you going to use to support that? Just like they would in an essay, and then have them debate. Maybe you bring in a teacher who's on his or her planning period, if they're willing to give it up, to be the judge. Because if you judge, they're going to think you're being unfair. You're doing that because she's your favorite or whatever. All right. Have students anonymously submit their thesis statements or paragraphs, and then ask students to rank those from most effective to least effective and be ready to explain why. The winner gets something, and then everyone gets to revise, and the class selects the best revision as a winner too. So you're supporting, hey, this is great. And you're also supporting and celebrating the student who's revising and getting better. Okay, that's a great way to involve it. You do it anonymously, kids get feedback, and even the kid who struggles the most as a writer will be able to look at things and say, hey, that's really good. I don't know why it's really good, but it's really good. I just did this activity with a class in Texas last week, a literature class, and even students who had struggled to participate all year were able to recognize the top 2 paragraphs. And they were able, once we focused on those 2 paragraphs and we talked about why they were good, those students were able to really articulate what was effective about those paragraphs. And then they got to use those paragraphs as a model to revise their own for the next day. And then finally, some people are aware of this, but the idea of a progressive essay, where one student starts with a thesis, passes it along to the next student who writes a paragraph for it, and so on. Doing this one time is not really effective. Doing it 3 or 4 times across the year is better, because students learn, oh, I have to write a thesis that everyone can understand, because that person has to be able to write a paragraph on it. And I have to write a paragraph that makes sense with that thesis, because that person has to write the next paragraph, and so on. So don't think about these as just fun activities to do. These are things that will help you and students really focus in on things that they know they need to work on. Before we move on, I just wanted to bring in this quote about complexity from the literature CED, and I used this a couple months back with another Perfection Learning webinar. And so from the CED on page 105, it says students should understand that interwoven and nuanced relationships among literary elements in a text ultimately contribute to the complexity of the work. That is a huge sentence. That could be the key enduring understanding for the whole literature course. And that's what a student who's really writing the highest level of essays is going to be able to do. It's important to remind students, especially if you're teaching literature to seniors after spring break. I taught seniors for 14 years. I completely understand what it's like and the malaise that they are in. I was in a school today, half a day, with a teacher who, well, I spent some time with an 8th grade teacher, but then I spent some time with a 12th grade teacher. And the students were saying, we're trying, miss, we're trying, but we're so dragging. This is the week after their spring break. So I kind of remind them, and I asked that teacher to remind them, it's not about how bad you want it, it's about how hard you're willing to work for it. So let's talk about how we celebrate and build up our students then. So I'm going to talk about reviewing first. So reviewing for the AP Lit exam, you don't really have content to review. Not really. You're not like a social studies teacher, a history teacher, a biology teacher, where you're reviewing things that kids need to know, facts about biology or facts about history. Okay, you're really focusing on skills and knowledge. What students can do with a text, how they can apply things that they know about literature to a text. So your review should focus on what students can do with a text. And so some questions to ask yourself can they read and decipher a pre-20th century text? It's about focusing on sentences and building from there. They're going to say, what in the world is happening here? I totally don't understand this. Well, stop. Read it sentence by sentence. Slow down. In the case of the multiple choice, I encourage you to use the question stems. The prompts for essays, try to give a little bit of background. What can that tell you to help you understand what's happening in the passage? Can they find a complexity in a text? We've already talked about how important that is, the focus on the shifts, contrasts, conflicts, paradoxes, and ambiguities. You got to live there. They're not sophomores. Some of them may be sophomores, but in most cases, freshmen, sophomores, we're asking them to prove facts about a text. I say, this is what the book's about. Okay, for the literature course, college level performance, we've got to really look at complexity. What's the tension? Can they, this is one that often gets neglected, can they explain the difference between literal and figurative language? And they need to be able to focus on how each works in a text. If they see that thing that's used literally, does it also have a figurative meaning? And can they talk about that? If so, they're navigating some complexity of language. And you say, well, that seems like a trick, maybe. It's not a trick. It is a trick. Say, hey, if you see that metaphor, well, talk about it. What does it literally mean? And then how does it figuratively work in the text? But that's the analysis you want. Can they find key details in a text and explain why they matter? Can you ask them to read a text in 5 minutes and say, at the end, I want you, all of you, to give me 5 key details from the text that you think are significant and be ready to explain why? Because that's exactly what they're going to have to do. Those key details could be really open. It could be concrete. It tells you what color her hair is, down to an image or a metaphor. Focus on what is said, not only the figurative language. And I want to shout out my retired colleague who is not on this call, but she deserves all the credit in the world for helping me out and mentoring me years ago, Terry Foltz, for telling me one time to remind students that if they're talking about what the author does, they're analyzing. If they're talking about what characters do, they're probably summarizing. Not in all cases. And yes, you can summarize if you talk about what the author does, but it works as a reminder. And then I like to show examples to students. Can they talk about what an author does and not just about what characters do? Focus on analysis, not just comprehension or summary. Now let's talk about question 3. And it says expect, it should say accept. I'll fix that. I'm so sorry, but you should expect question 3, but I mean, accept question 3. Question 3 is a little bit different. They do, as you well know, need to know some content for that. They don't need to have memorized quotes. Okay, let me just put that out there. They can simply make specific references to things that happen in the text. They do not have to have memorized quotes for it. And a reminder, as much as some of us don't want to see this, whatever they write about will be scored. If they write about hills like white elephants, it'll be scored. If they write about the Tale of Two Cities, it'll be scored. And the readers and the reading leadership are really good about making certain and reminding readers, scorers, that every essay should get the same fair, equal treatment, regardless of what they're writing about. So with this, I suggest 2 or 3 novels. They have 2 or 3 novels that they've reviewed, they know really well. Maybe a contemporary, a classic, and a mid-20th century, just so they have a variety. Okay, I encourage different genders. I also encourage different racial backgrounds. Okay, it's all good to help feed into what the student can use on question 3. I encourage a comedy and a drama. Okay, so if we think about drama in general, they should have a comedy and a dramatic play. But in the end, it's just if they only have one thing that they know really, really well, they'll be okay. I promise. We can talk more about that because I know some of you are like, yeah, but there'll be opportunity for that. Don't worry. I do want you to know, though, that the complexity of the novel is correlated to the score as it is more difficult to write about. So I am not saying that students who write about a more complex novel are guaranteed a higher score. Nor am I saying if students write about a less complex novel, they're going to get a lower score. But if you look at a lot of the essays, there is a correlation between the complexity of the novel, not the length, the complexity of the novel, and the score on the essay. That's something to think about and something to talk with your students about. But I will then bring you back up here to this or. Just write about something they know really well. Can they write an argument where they're making specific references to the text that they've chosen? Here's something that I created a while back and have consistently used and shared with my APSI attendees. This is what I call Booksheets. I used to print it out front and back. Now I do it on Google Docs. This is a great thing to use for question 3. It doesn't get them into too much of quoting and things like that, but we deal with thematic statements. So we've got our yin yang here. We have characters, and they're changing or they're static or dynamic. Ideas associated with them. We've got conflicts and ideas associated with those. Moments. I want to know 10 moments. Okay, probably plot moments and so on. 2 or 3 things related to setting, 2 or 3 things related to symbols in the text, and then just brief. What's the central problem? How does it climax? What's the resolution? It is hard to see on the screen. I'm so sorry. I do have it as a Google Doc, and I will share it with my colleagues at Perfection, and they may be able to share it out as a file in some way. I will see. If not, you'll have access to this recording. You can come back to it, pause it here, and enlarge it, and so on. So this was inspired by many of the consultants from whom I've learned over the years. And I took one of theirs and that was much larger and longer and really too much and cut it down to say, what do I need? What do my students need? Okay. So let's talk about celebrating student growth and building up their confidence. This begins now or yesterday, or maybe you've been doing it all year. It's easy, especially if you have a class that is really dragging or they don't have a good attitude, and I want to be really careful with that because it's so easy for just a few students to ruin the attitude of the course for everyone else. And we'll talk about that in just a moment and how you can work with that. But you will be so much better off if you start celebrating those kids who can or who are working. This matters for all students, even if you know that they get it. Even the student who's been doing really, really well all year, and as terrible as this sounds, you're like, I don't have to worry about that student or those 2 or 3 students as much as I need to worry about these. You're still doing things for them. You're still reading their papers. You're still giving them some feedback. You're still talking with them. You're still involving them in the discussion. So they matter. So don't forget to build them up and celebrate them too. Remember, you can't just tell. The peers have to see it too. And that comes back to this idea of using student papers, sharing peer papers, and so on. I suggest a couple of things. Write the Post-it note. Write it. Thomas, I see how hard you worked on this. I really appreciate what you're doing here, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Be specific, be consistent. Kids can see through it. They know when they're being patronized. They know when you're not being serious. You have to mean it. But everybody on this webinar means it. Everybody on this webinar cares about their kids, cares about their students showing off what they can do. That's why you're on this webinar. Celebrate growth over static scores. Think about that for a second. I've mentioned it earlier, but really lift up the student who's doing now what they couldn't do at the beginning of the year, or for whom it's suddenly clicked. Now, I know none of us are going to embarrass a kid by saying, hey, Thomas was terrible last semester. Now he's really getting it. None of us are going to do that. Okay. We got to be careful not to accidentally imply that, but we don't even have to use the student's name. Remember that. You can just use that student's essay anonymously. Talk to the student first. And the other kids may not know it, but the kid knows. And it matters to the kid. And that kid will remember it not tomorrow, not just on exam day, but 5 years from now. That kid will remember that. The next one here is closely consider the reasons you are giving awards to the kid who gets a 6. I see lots of things on social media and so on where people are giving, and I think this is cute. I really do. And I would probably do this too. Giving away unicorn stickers. I don't know why unicorns in quotes. Okay. Unicorn stickers, unicorn little toys, unicorn pencils, whatever, to the kid because the 6 is such a unicorn. True. Okay. But how are you also rewarding the kid who's been writing 3s all year and suddenly gets a 4? You're seeing a pattern here. All those kids deserve to be celebrated. It's even worth celebrating that kid who's been writing a 1, who could barely get a thesis. That's an argument. And suddenly they write that thesis, they get a decent paragraph, some evidence, and now they're getting a 2 or a 3. Oh, sorry about that. I say maybe give awards to the person who improves their essay score by 2 or improves their multiple choice questions by 5%. Use the work by the student who has struggled as an example of what to do. I just talked about that. All right, once they get it, make them a good example of what to do. And this is really important. This is something that you should be doing all year, I think, but especially over the next several weeks. Call out great ideas from reluctant or struggling students. They're in a group, they're working on something. Say, hey, I want to share something I heard Thomas say because it's really a good idea. Okay, you got to be genuine. Okay, and it needs to be a good idea because kids know. But when you hear it, celebrate it big time. Basically, be growth and praise minded all the time, but especially over the next few weeks. Another thing I like to remind my students is don't watch the clock. Do what it does. Just keep going. Now, you will need to be careful of time. You will need to watch out, and kind of time where you are. And I've encouraged you to do that, but I don't want students to stress about it. Just keep going. Okay, now let's be real about a couple things. And this is for you. It's not necessarily for your students. You need to contextualize these things for your own well-being. And I really want all of you to know, and your colleagues who aren't here to know, that you have done and are enough for them. Remember, there will be good and bad surprises. The kid who has done well all year is going to tank. Okay, you don't know which kid it's going to be. Okay, but go ahead and be prepared for it to happen. I hope it doesn't happen, but it might happen. For some kids, a 2 on the exam essay would feel like a 5. Okay, and it should for you too. And I could not just say an exam essay, it should just be the exam period. A 2 on the exam will feel like a 5 because they came in and they could barely get anything done. And you may need to have that conversation with some kids. It depends on you and your relationship with your students and their context and so on. Percentage-wise, most kids will not earn a qualifying score. It's close, but most won't. But that's very likely not because of what you did or didn't do. It is a timed exam. I know you know that. I'm just reminding you, given all the time in the world, most people would get this. But they have 3 hours. They will still take these skills forward. You still have prepared them. You still have done things for them that they will use next year and beyond. So you see, I've just got this picture here called Water Your Flowers. And I want to be real clear about this. And this is a shout out to the ELA manager here in Cincinnati, with whom I work really, really closely. And I've celebrated her for reminding me and everyone of this. But you work with students, you do everything you can for all of your students. But there comes a time when you have to stop watering the rocks, stop watering the weeds, and just water the flowers, because those are the ones that are really working and are really going to grow. Now, that's kind of controversial. It could sound like I'm asking you to give up on kids. I'm not. But you can't make kids do the work that they need to do. So that flower might be a kid who you know is going to get a 1 or a 2 on the exam, but they're working, and you're going to continue to work for that kid. Okay. Are you accountable for all of them? Yes. Have you done your best for all of them to a point? Yes. All right. And that's kind of the anxiety of teaching. I get it. But I am giving you permission. I want you to give yourself the grace of knowing that you've done and you are enough for those kids. And you can water your flowers and focus on the ones who are really working. I'll get emails about that. I can handle it. Okay, so you've heard me talk a lot. This is rare. Usually I have points where I stop and do some questions and things throughout, but I'd like to take the next few minutes and maybe field some questions from y'all. As you think about those questions and drop them in the chat, I've got a couple of frequently asked questions here. What if students don't finish the MCQs? They will finish the MCQs. They must. All right. Even if they've got 5 minutes remaining and they have 20 questions to answer, they got to fill in bubbles because they don't want to leave blanks. Thou shalt not leave blanks. Another very common email I get: must students do the essays in number order? No, they don't have to do the essays in number order. I used to encourage my students to do the essay that they felt the most comfortable with first to get it out of the way. Some kids told me, well, I'd rather save that for the end. That's fine. What I worry about, though, is that kids are going to do the hardest essays, spend more time on those, and then they're going to run out of time and not do the essay that they're the most comfortable with, not have enough time to do well on it. So it depends on whichever logic you're most comfortable with. But talk to your students about that. Does length of the essays matter? No, but yes. So no, it needs to be a well-developed argument. It needs to have evidence. It needs to be explained. However, is there a correlation between length of essay and score? Yes. Okay. So when in doubt, tell students to explain, explain, explain. Okay. If they find themselves getting repetitive, maybe they don't need to explain as much, but one of my favorite things to tell students to put in the middle of a paragraph is this phrase: not only X, but also Y. And that pushes them to take whatever they're saying in that paragraph to the next level, often dealing with complexity and contrast. What if students write FRQ3 about a movie or a show? It's going to happen. They're going to write about Harry Potter, not one book, all of them. It's going to happen. That essay will still be scored. It will be given the same credit that any other essay is given. Some people say, well, what's the point? It's what's being scored is not the student's knowledge of a book. What's being scored is the student's ability to develop a well-supported, well-reasoned literary argument that addresses the prompt. Now, you may not want to tell your students that, but I want you to know that if a kid comes back to you and says, oh, I wrote about Breaking Bad, You don't have to freak out. And one that I've gotten just a couple of times here in the past few months that I hadn't really heard much about before. Can students mention other texts when they write the FRQs? And I drilled down on this a little bit with a teacher and said, so can you give me an example? They said, well, they were writing about one of the poems and they mentioned a novel that they had read that had a similar idea. I thought, yeah, they can totally do that. They're connecting to something beyond the poem itself. The only thing I would encourage you to watch out for, and I would even warn students about it, I would encourage you to watch out for whether or not students are digressing into discussion of that novel by itself or that other text by itself and leaving behind the argument that they're trying to make in that particular essay. Okay, so I've got a couple questions here in the chat. I want to go ahead and address some of these. Nicole Z, thank you for your question, says, do you recommend bubbling all one letter if time is running out, or vary it up? Doesn't matter. I have nothing in my psychometrics background to give an answer other than I do know that ETS, their algorithm is completely random. They try to run it as random as possible as to what the answers are. So there you go. So I don't think it's going to matter either way. Okay. Thank you for your question, Nicole. Christine F. On the digital exam, can students look through and at all of the questions easily? Yes. So what we have been told as consultants is this year, unlike last year, which was a mess, this year students can read through the questions and then go back. That's why I said that without a caveat. I'm glad you asked that, Christine, because last year's digital exam, they could not go back. But we have been told that this year they will be able to. Okay, great. I should have addressed that. Thank you. Carla L, how do you get the perfectionist to move on? Timing. She says she has a student, a Lang student, that was A+, got a 2 last May, and admitted to me last week that she never got to FRQ3 at all. I think those timing drills, even though it's going to drive that student crazy and probably make them cry, are going to be the best things for them. You know, get your thesis written, get this written. Okay. Remember, students are allowed to carry an old-fashioned wristwatch. They can't have a smartwatch, they can't have their phones or whatever, but they can have that. And I encourage students to have that and use it while they're working. Okay. Now, if it's a smartwatch and they get a message or something on it, it could jeopardize their exam. But just tell them to go buy a $9 Timex at Walmart, or asking their students, ask their parents if they could borrow one or whatever. All the exam rooms are required to have clocks. Train them, get them trained on how to manage their time. So important. Okay. Do you recommend giving students, Valerie M's question, do you recommend giving students a full-length timed practice essay in the weeks before the exam? No. No, I don't. Now, I do recommend giving a full-length timed practice exam, but I would have recommended you do it in late February, early March, so that you could build off of what students have done. You could take those essays and have students work with them and build on them and improve them. You could take the multiple choice responses or the multiple choice results and mine them for things that you could use to teach. But doing it over the next couple of weeks, you're really not going to be able to use it for much, especially building around when your spring break falls, how your schedule falls with things. And you could actually add more stress, unnecessary stress to yourself and students, because if those students are taking your AP and several other APs and other AP teachers are doing the same, it's really going to add a lot of unnecessary stress. So I don't necessarily recommend doing that right now. But I do think that's a good idea to do a little bit earlier in the second semester. Okay, if you're interested in doing that sort of thing, reach out to me. I've helped a lot of places plan and organize that sort of thing over the last couple of years, and be happy to talk with you about doing it at your school next year. Let's see. Nicole had another one here. Nicole Z. Do you notice that digital essays score better or worse than handwritten ones? I have not seen that at all. That would be an interesting study to do. You've got my mind reeling a little bit now, but I've not noticed it. And in my conversations with people who would know, nothing like that has come up. But maybe I have to go and do a study for that. Thank you, Nicole. Okay, I want to remind you here as we get ready to wrap up, as always at the end of these webinars, I'd like to remind us that we are risk takers and mistake makers. All right, it's okay to make some mistakes. We reflect, we move on, we make things better constantly. Check out the books that you all have, some of you have just mentioned to me. I appreciate it. I was lucky enough to get to work on them with some wonderful people. Here is one opportunity for some AP study this summer. I'm working with my dear friend, Tim Freitas, and we are leading some summer workshops. You can, there's a link here, and I will share this link in the chat. And at these workshops, we will have some special guests. Colin McCann, the author of A Paragon, National Book Award winner, will be visiting. One of the workshops will be live. The other one will have to do video live as like, Zoom. The other one will be a recording. And then Sarah Zerwin, from the writer of the book Pointless, will also be attending and visiting one of these workshops virtually. And we may have some other guests too. Last year we had the chief reader, and we also had my friend who runs Teach Living Poets. So you might want to check those out. If you have any problem with the fees, let me or Tim know. And there's always ways we can work around things if you are in a situation where you're restricted as far as your fundage goes. And I just accidentally clicked on it. Finally, I want to say, given the environment, I've been sharing this quote: the books that the world calls immoral are the books that show the world its own shame. I think that's very telling right now. You're going to get a very brief two-question survey from my colleagues at Perfection. Please fill it out. It's all about you getting more webinars, getting better webinars. Well, maybe not better webinars, but more webinars and topics that you want. And I'm going to ask you to please be in touch. You can catch me at these handles on Twitter and on Instagram. Thank you all so much. Kristen?
Thank you, Brandon, for your time and your insights tonight. We all greatly appreciated it, and I really liked the quote at the end. As a reminder to all participants, Perfection Learning will send out an email on Friday of this week with the recording of both tonight's and tomorrow's webinars. If you want to learn more from Brandon, please take the time to subscribe to the Next Step blog from Perfection Learning at nextstep.perfectionlearning.com. There you will find recordings of Brandon's past webinars, blog posts, and lesson plans. As Brandon just mentioned, please be sure to complete the 2-question survey at the link provided in the chat. This will let us know what topics you want to see covered by Brandon or other experts in future webinars. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. I hope to see many of you at the AP Language webinar tomorrow evening. And for those who aren't able to join us tomorrow, please have a great finish to your week. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. And some of you will see I've just reshared my screen because some of you had asked about my APSI plans for the summer. And so here are my dates and my APSIs that I'll be presenting at, including the Garden of English ones. So thank you all so much. Please be in touch.